Well, there was so much to talk about in your lecture about emotions that it's hard to pick a topic. But let me start by just with a basic idea of what emotions are, as opposed to let's start with moods, because they feel very much alike, and yet when you think about a mood like depression or exhilaration, or being up, is a mood. It doesn't seem as if it is directed at an object which you are then interpreting and then evaluating and then feeling something about it. It seems more pervasive. It's like maybe toward the world.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I distinguished moods from emotions, because in my lecture I was focused on this conceptual explanation for how our emotions function, and that explains all the short-lived affective states that function that way. But we have other affective states, and some of them are in a kind of gray area, and the moods are certainly like that. The general background feeling you have about your life and what's going on around you is there, but what is it a response to? Sometimes people feel like it's a response to the world, but sometimes that's an error, because it seems like in some of these cases that's not exactly what's happening, so it's not clear. On the other hand, I heard some recent research, I don't know how valid it is, saying that people who were depressed tended to focus on big, vague, unanswerable questions and pursue goals that were vaguely defined and hard to see how you would achieve. Whereas people that weren't depressed tended to focus on goals that were practically achievable for them.
Interesting, yeah.
And so maybe that feeling then of depression in those cases actually would have a conceptual basis and be really like an emotion, just on a broader state, where a person is feeling a broad frustration with the world, where they're struggling to see how they can achieve their goals and feeling frustrated and defeated because of that. And that's certainly, I think there's a lot of science that still needs to be done here to explain what's going on. So I don't want to say philosophy says it must be this, but it's an interesting subject, certainly.
Yeah, and I mean, depression is one of the things in psychology, particularly in clinical psychology, that has been studied, and I think we actually know quite a bit, particularly about how a person who is depressed tends to have negative thinking, and that self-perpetuates and is actually in many cases fallacious, overgeneralizing and stuff like that. So, but also, there's also some pretty good evidence that there are biological dispositions.
Right, I talk about personality traits too.
Right,
in this respect.
yeah.
Like being quick-tempered or placid, and you get an affective feeling in these characteristic patterns of action that you have.
Right.
But again, are these emotions on the classic model? It's not exactly so clear, and people differ from childhood even in some aspects of their temperament. You can observe it, and so it's not real clear how their subconscious thinking necessarily controls that.
Well, some aspects of temperament, I think it's been pretty well established, are genetic, or inborn anyway, not acquired. I mean, they're observed from very early ages. But
you think of like the twins separated at birth, and
exactly,
they're both taciturn, or they're both cheerful.
Right. But I think those things have not so much. What's inborn is not the content of any emotion. It's more like how rapidly emotions arise, how rapidly you respond, or how slowly, or a degree of the ease with which you become anxious by what's new or what might be fearful. And so it's not what it's not what's important as far as I can tell from. I'm not an expert in the field, but from what I can tell, it's not that you will be disposed to fear this or that thing. It's that if you are relatively fearful, whatever it is you are inclined to fear will happen faster.
Right.
But temperament is, wow, it's such an important thing that we pick up about other people. I mean, you know, when you talk about someone's personality, like you were in your lecture, I think temperament is one of the first things you tend to get.
And it's fascinating. That's another thing I touch on briefly in the lecture, how there's this capacity that some people call emotional intelligence, where people are able to judge subconsciously an immense amount of information about other people and sympathize with them and recognize their emotional states, all through a lightning quick process of thinking and feeling that happens.
Yeah, and it's. I was thinking of an example that that made me realize and appreciate what you were saying about how much actual cognitive processing goes on behind emotions. So what I was picturing in my head is, so I'm out in the street, someone is approaching me. What do I literally see? Well, I can see enough to know that they are approaching me because they're closing the gap between us in a straight line. That's a literal perception, and the direction of their gaze is at me. I can see that too. Beyond that, I can see their appearance. But what's going on in my mind is, assuming this is someone I don't know, what's the purpose? That's what I'm focused on, and I'm reading. You know, if it's a disheveled-looking guy who's scowling and talking to himself, I have one reaction, and that puts me into a range of speculation about it. And all this is happening. I'm putting into words what's happening in microseconds.
That's right.
You know, if it's a beautiful woman with a smile on her face, you know, I'm in a different range of potential feelings. But all of that is, if you actually worked out the epistemology, so to speak, of what's going on. I see the man scowling. I know from experience, inductive experience, what homeless people who are deranged look like. We're in Washington, and I'm talking about standing on a street corner in pretty much central Washington. So, if it's I'm also know that he's not probably approaching me to solicit for some environmental cause. Whereas, you know, if someone's got anyway, you know what I mean.
It's just fascinating the amount of calculation that goes on in your subconscious and the mass of information that your brain brings to work in that situation. I mean, I think it's probably a philosophical error to attribute that to emotion as such, but rather that the emotion is the affective aspect of the experience of what all that subconscious cognition is coming together with.
Yeah,
and there's an emotional valence to it, or a way you feel about it. But the real weight of the work that's being done isn't so much in how you feel, but in the judgments your mind is reaching about the people that you're dealing with.
That's really important, because just to stay with my example for another second, a lot of times I see someone approaching and I have no idea. I'm making inferences. I'm running hypotheses behind, you know, sort of behind the or below the level of consciousness, but I'm not feeling anything. I don't, in a sense, know what to feel until I know what's happening. So, and we make all kinds of judgments. You know, we make a decision. We don't necessarily have a strong affective decision, but our minds are putting together and integrating bodies of things and considerations. Or a baseball player for example, an outfielder from experience will automatically throw to the right base. He's probably not feeling anything particularly intense. He's doing his job. But
Right,
it's
that's a
there's
perfect
a judgment.
example
Yeah.
of a subconscious judgment that isn't particularly emotional.
Right. So, but it is amazing that human beings can do this, because philosophically, as I was trying to build into my story, all we literally see are facial structures, eyes, motion, but we are picking up subtle things that we reflect that lead us to make judgments about the things we cannot possibly see, such as all the
We
things
could
in the other
never, at
person's
least we
mind.
could never, if we were asked to identify what was in our field of vision, we couldn't attend to it in a way in our sight to just say what those things were, and yet somehow our minds are picking them out.
Yeah, often we couldn't say. I did read. It was an interesting study that showed pictures, just pictures of people with different expressions on their face, and asking viewers, is this person angry, happy, sad, afraid? And there was widespread agreement, not only among people within a culture or society, but across cultures and society. It's that, so there's probably, our brains are wired, thanks to evolution, to pick up, just to notice and do something with, process cognitively, many subtle features of it. And it makes sense, we're social animals.
Well, an aspect of that doesn't have anything to do with emotion is facial recognition. So one of the things that
right.
humans are very, very good at is facial recognition.
Right.
We don't have hand recognition the same way. Like you can identify thousands and thousands of individuals that you've met because you've seen their face sometime, but if you showed one of them your hand, you just wouldn't know. That's so-and-so's hand. I don't know.
Yeah.
Right? But you think about that, that's fascinating, because that's an example of what has to be an inbuilt capacity that we have,
Right.
where it just is so much easier and more automatic for us to recognize subtle aspects of facial structure and remember them in a way we're not able to do as easily with other features of the world.
Actually, there's a whole portion of the cortex that is devoted to facial recognition, and when there's damage there, people have something called prosopagnosis. I think that's what it's called. They can't recognize faces, even their own, in the mirror, and they can do everything else. But anyway, what we do in picking up those clues, it makes sense that since we are social animals, we live in society, and what we do and the way we act depends on this incredible complex inner world of beliefs and goals and intentions and feelings, commitments and doubts about commitments, that is orders of magnitude, I couldn't even count the orders of magnitude, more complex than even a very smart chimpanzee. Most animals, social animals, can detect whether someone's a threat or friendly, and read intent at whatever level animals have specific intents. But humans,
We're having to infer a whole theory of the other person's mind.
that's right,
Feeling, character, intentions,
exactly.
inclinations, and we infer all of that, which is a fascinating capacity we have.
It's incredible. So, as you've pointed out in several examples, it's not emotions per se that do it. It's the cognitive apparatus that lies behind emotions that also is used on a much wider scale than than I think we always appreciate, and especially philosophers always appreciate, because we're all about conscious thought and proof and all of that.
We've been talking here, David, about the ways in which we have affective states that may not be very amenable to changes with our from our thinking patterns. Like what exactly you can do thinking differently to change your temperament. It's not very clear, and it's not clear that you can. Anyway,
Right.
there's more psychological work to be done teasing out what's under our control and what isn't. But in that context, I think still, don't you think objectivism is in the key of action, of autonomy for these issues? That what objectivism points out is that for a vast range of our emotional life, for many, many, many of the feelings we have, they're tied into a subconscious system that is affected by how we choose to think and that reflects our patterns of thinking over the long term. And so if you find yourself with some discontinuity in your thinking, some way your feelings don't line up with your thinking, then probably there's a way you can resolve that issue through practice and working on the issue yourself, because there's a lot of mental plasticity, there's a lot of subconscious reprogramming that you can do.
Oh yeah, no, I think the core message, is, as you laid it out in your lecture, is one of efficacy in altering your emotional reactions because of the cognitive learned interpretations and evaluations that lie behind them. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what we've been talking about is the outer limits of that power, and we can't specify. We don't know how to set those limits on purely philosophical grounds. We just know there are some. But we do know philosophically that emotions are broadly speaking determined by underlying ideas, and we can change those. Now, in some cases, sometimes it's relatively easy. Sometimes it's very, very hard. When you get down to those deeper value assumptions that may go back to childhood, and that's why people pay a lot of money to good therapists, and sometimes over many years. But I would say, I would think one's attitude should be, I'm going to try until I reach a point where I'm pretty confident this is something about me that I will just accept. But it's so important, because when there's a conflict between what you consciously believe or value and the way your emotions work, you're not aligned. You're not in a state of non-contradictory joy. And alignment, just having your mind, your emotions, and your thoughts aligned, your beliefs and your actions aligned. That's integrity. I mean, all of these things are really important for personal happiness.
Sure.
So.
And for feeling like you're running on all cylinders, so that the way you react to someone in the short
Right.
term and what you feel about it in the short term is what you think, once you consider it, is basically the way you would have liked to.
Yeah.
And that's what you'd like to have your life be like.
Yeah, that you said firing on all cylinders, and it reminded me of another kind of maybe image to carry in mind, a flow. When you're in flow, everything is aligned, firing on all cylinders, and specifically, your feelings and your thoughts are just and that's a great state to be in. If we could do that all the time, there's our power and our happiness would be unlimited.